I'm the public health veterinarian, newly started in August at the BC. I'm not Helen Schwanze, who's on the program as the moderator. Unfortunately, Helen wasn't able to join today, so I'm pleased to fill in for her.
Okay, I'm going to have
Our
to
session
try this.
after the break and before lunch is on avian influenza. So that'll be a really good session with 4 speakers, starting off with Dr. Vicky Bose from the BC MAG.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about the avian influenza outbreak that occurred in December of last year. I just want to acknowledge the fact there's a number of people in the room who were actively engaged in this outbreak response, and everybody worked really hard. And if you get a chance to listen to what other people's experiences are, I'm here just trying to represent the overview, and I'm also trying to put into perspective the bigger picture on this, because we were quite blindsided by the dynamics of this particular outbreak. So the key messages and the context in which we work with in poultry with avian influenza. Avian influenza is incredibly complicated, and if you think you have a handle on avian influenza, you're wrong, because it's so complicated, but it's incredibly fascinating. It keeps a lot of people inspired. So anyways, AI, the problem with a lot of things, planning for outbreaks and putting in mitigation strategies for prevention, AI defies useful generalization. You can't make a lot of rules around AI, because invariably the next outbreak will break all the rules that you're familiar with, and that's exactly what happened to us in December of 2014. AI is not just one virus. But the viruses are constantly in flux, they're constantly mutating. So the virus that starts your outbreak is rarely the virus that you get at the last detection. In particular, when it comes to high-path AI in poultry, it's not just a poultry disease. The eradication response is really driven by trade implications. It's a very political disease, as well as a disease caused by a virus. What I want to present, and the context I wanted to put it into, is we actually had an extraordinary event happen because it was a success. This rarely happens. If you look at the global outbreaks of avian influenza in poultry, rarely do you have an event occur in which containment was achieved so rapidly. And it comes down to all of the work that happened within the BC poultry industry to try to manage the potential of an avian influenza outbreak. The truth is, it's the early activities that the poultry industry engages in that can influence the scope and duration of any outbreak. And that occurred, a very nice example in British Columbia. So you're having a prepared industry, your outbreak is not going to be as big. Is there a way to get the lights down? It's very washed out for me. I don't know if you guys can see this or not. Oh, okay, forget it. So the history of high-path AI in North America, because we have a different situation than Asia or Europe or Africa. The big outbreaks of high-path AI in poultry populations, I guess we go back to the Pennsylvania outbreak in '82 and '83 in the United States. There's also, in Mexico, they're dealing with high-path AI. They're actually currently dealing with 2 high-path AI circulating viruses in which they're having to manage. They've chosen vaccination, which means nobody's going to buy Mexican product, because that's the context of influenza. 2004, we had a big one. We had an outbreak of H5N2 in commercial poultry in the Fraser Valley. At the same time, the United States decided they wanted to have an outbreak too, and they had a single farm. It was a very interesting outbreak event. It was the first time they accepted the OIE definition of the genetic sequencing, and it turned out that the outbreak in the United States in 2004 was really not acting high path, but it did conform to the definition. So in Saskatchewan, we had an H5N2 in 2007, and Mexico, again, the second circulating virus I mentioned emerged in 2012. Now, in particular, the dynamic of high-path viruses in poultry is that there's a circulating low-path virus that gets into commercial poultry, has all this mutational opportunity, and from that comes out high-path viruses. That changed for us completely last December, because what happened was we had the introduction of a virus that was already high-path that had been, I don't know, it's getting any worse. Okay, we'll move on. This is actually really important. I wanted to highlight where this virus came from. So I'll try to quickly go through it. So this virus that we dealt with in 2014, almost a year ago, it actually, the H5 component, which gives it the high pathogenicity characteristic, it goes all the way back. It's attached to that circulating H5N2 in China that emerged in 1996. So in fact, the H5 component has carried through. So they're thinking possibly in China, there was a reassortment event in which that H5 coming from the H5N2 combined with an N8 of waterfowl origin, and we have an H5N8 that's clade 2.3.4.4 as a high-path virus. So it first was detected almost 2 years ago in the spring and early and late winter in South Korea and Japan, and they had outbreaks in commercial poultry, but mostly in wild birds as well. So this, if you want to follow it through, what happened is this broke out into the intercontinental group A viruses with the H5N8, that's a high-path virus. So the detections were in South Korea and Japan, and then suddenly it disappeared. And so for 5 months during the summer of 2014, there were no detections at all. And the presumption is that this virus moved through the movement of migratory birds up into East Russia. And during that time on the migratory bird breeding grounds, it started to split off into other different lineages. So the intercontinental group A virus number 1 was in the fall, showed up in Germany, Netherlands, the UK, and Italy, causing outbreaks in commercial poultry as well as wild birds. And Japan, you'll see Japan's all over here. I feel sorry for Japan. They're getting all these, whoops, that's crazy. So anyways, the intercontinental group A2 viruses came through. We had some detections in the fall in South Korea and Taiwan. If you follow that through, that's the virus we ended up with. There was also the split off of intercontinental group A3, which showed up again in Japan and Korea. So this, if you follow it through here, we have an H5N8 high path being circulated on wild birds, coming all the way through, and then suddenly, here it is. And we were the first area to detect that, the presence of a high path H5. We did not have the H5N8. What we had is a reassortment that was an H5N2. Right now, the same virus is gone and is causing havoc in Taiwan because that H5N2 is now, there's variable reassortments, and they're really struggling to control those outbreaks there. So the outbreak I'm going to talk about is the H5N2, and this is the outbreak that occurred in BC, Ontario, and the Midwest. So that's kind of where this thing came from. The other component which we find as well is it's very possible that the South Korea, the re-emergence was not related to the movement of birds, but in fact it may represent local environmental persistence of this virus in South Korea. And that's a component that we had to battle, that we do think that there's heavy environmental contamination at the time of these outbreaks because of the migratory birds. So what we're thinking has happened is that we've had the crossover through the, over the land bridge, but in air. So it's coming back through, and it's coming down through the Pacific Flyway, and then we had our detection here. We don't know what species are carrying it. There's a lot of information about this virus that's missing. And so there's a lot of people trying to figure that out, but of course, blame the birds. So what happened is, what you'll find is that there was this Eurasian H5N8, we'll call it the Korean virus, came through intact into North America. Locally, very, very locally, there was a reassortment event in a waterfowl species. And what we have emerging from that is the intercontinental American version H5N2 high path. This is the virus that we were dealing with. And the genetic sequencing showed that it came in, and we have a combination of Eurasian and North American gene segments there. Anyways. So I want to just review again the unique features of this. And I say unique is because this is what we didn't plan for. it's transported as a high path virus. That is very unusual. Usually we think of low path viruses, the reservoir being the wild migratory birds. But right now it is being transported as a high path virus in birds without clinical signs, and it's been shown in some infectivity studies in the US that the mallards can shed this virus up to 14 days as they're moving it around. It is the third recorded high path poultry back to wild bird events, because usually, again, because it's a high path virus, it's very, very unique. It does kill raptors and Canada geese, and at this point they are probably the best sentinels that we've got for the presence of this virus in the wild bird population. US infectivity studies have been very interesting. It turns out that turkeys in particular have a much longer mean death time than chickens. So in turkeys, it's looking like they can be infected, they could shed lots and lots of virus for 5 to 9 days, but once they become clinical, they're dead within 24 hours. So they have a long shedding period, very different from chickens where the incubation period is considered to be 2 to 4 days, very short. The big outbreak in the United States, it turned out that as the outbreak went out of control, the virus actually didn't really change very much, but it turned out that it started to gain adaptation to the poultry species, which is a big concern. The easier it is to infect a chicken, the more likely you're going to get a bigger outbreak. So that virus in particular, the poultry adapted virus, is considered to have been eradicated. So we have to fall back to the dynamic of this other earlier H5N2 that is still much more wild bird adapted. Despite all of that, the huge outbreak in the United States, the virus remains genetically unstable, and this is making a lot of people scratch their head about what we know about influenza. This is the key point here. This H5 that's in this H5N2 that caused our outbreak is the same one that has killed humans in the H5N1 in China. So even though at the very beginning of this outbreak it was determined that the zoonotic risk of this particular virus was low, it's not going to take very much for this virus to change and possibly become a higher public health risk. So just to give you an idea of the BC poultry industry, we do live with high risk of avian influenza introductions because we have a very concentrated poultry growing area in the Fraser Valley there. 80% of the production for British Columbia occurs in the Fraser Valley for poultry products. It's multi-commodity, includes swine and includes thousands of backyard flocks. We are on the edge of the Pacific Flyway. We have a lot of overwintering and resident waterfowl species. During the winter, this is what the fields look like. It was very attractive to a lot of wild birds. And to this day, we actually do fairly limited AI surveillance in commercial poultry. We rely very heavily on the Provincial Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and our early detections all have come because of a submission to the vet lab. This picture was taken on the back of Sumas Mountain. Mount Baker is in the back here, so Washington State, but all of these silver buildings are a poultry growing operation, incredibly congested. Probably the most congested poultry growing area of all Canada. This picture was taken while they were depopulating one of the barns in the background there, and you can see just the spectrum of wild birds that are coexisting very close to poultry operations. They have already depopulated. This is a broiler breeder farm. They have depopulated the birds in this barn at this point. The birds, they're dead inside the barn, but you can see migratory birds almost up to the barn door. So we do have potential. So the initial detection was on Monday, December 1st. We had 2 completely independent submissions to the vet lab, both describing escalating mortality over the weekend. These farms lived 8 kilometers apart. They have no linkage whatsoever. They don't even know each other. Turns out one of the cases was a 24-week broiler breeder operation. The other was an 86-day meat turkey operation. Because of what we were seeing and the history of the catastrophic mortality that was occurring, we did run an avian influenza test, and within 4 hours we had a positive for H5. And with that kind of mortality, I think that's what we felt like. Every one of us who had gone through it before were having these kind of feelings anyways. So the 24-hour operational response, this is where the success was made. We had notification. CFIA was notified. They immediately put those farms under quarantine, as well as within 1 kilometer, they identified all of the farms, put them under quarantine. The private vets were notified, and they were to engage self-quarantine for their producers. Phone call to the producers. Pre-work was done. A self-quarantine is a very specific action that producers can take. We don't rely on a paper that says you're quarantined before action can be taken. The industry themselves start to lock themselves down. That's the success story. So the poultry industry was notified. They used their existing infrastructure to communicate, and they started to lock their own industry down. And then they established their own Industry Emergency Operations Center. The provincial government at the same time is starting to kick into gear. We're starting to map all of the commercial production facilities within 1 kilometer, 3 kilometer, and 10 kilometer zones around those 2 positive farms. At the same time, again, all within 24 hours, we have a joint emergency operations center that's being established, and we have co-directors between the Ministry of Agriculture and CFIA. So all of this is happening within 24 hours. It's quite remarkable. It's because we've gone around the block before. I presented this at a meeting in Mexico. They didn't get it. They totally didn't get this. So the fact that we'd gone through it before really saved our bacon this time. So containment zoning was employed. That is a very important political decision that is made in Ottawa by CFIA. And it's all about controlling the movement of poultry during an outbreak. These are what the zones look like. This line here is Washington State. That's where the vet lab is, that happy face here. The city of Abbotsford is under the X. And you can see, it turns out we had 11 positive farms. There's the 1 kilometer buffer zones are around the positive farms, and then we have these 10 kilometers, and it's like, well, why don't we just go ahead and make them all confluent? So once they were confluent, you can see these zones here. You can actually see if you were to extend this 10 kilometer buffer zone here, it would tip into Weiser Lake. And I'll bring that up because on December 10th, we started to get indications that the same high-path H5N8 virus was in Gyrfalcon in Linden, as well as detections of H5N2 and H5N1 reassortment viruses coming out of the wild birds on Weiser Lake. So this is kind of the section of where our outbreak occurred. And what's interesting is our detection was December 1st, and our last hit was December 18th. So within 3 weeks, this event was finalized. I also want to throw out here that within this 10 kilometer zone that was drawn around this whole cluster, we had almost 500 commercial operations go under surveillance, and there has to have been at least an estimate of 500 backyard flocks within a 70 square kilometer zone. So we had a huge population at risk, and it was the actions, the early actions and the containment activity that was really pivotal in controlling this. So another interesting point of view, when we had some plans, the whole idea of doing surveillance testing to try to keep ahead of the virus is that we would go in and test live birds in barns. And as it turned out, that the plan was that we'd go in and take oropharyngeal or coagual swabs for PCR, as well as taking some baseline blood samples. But what started to happen is we realized that we weren't getting any positives on the live bird sampling, but the negative bird, the mortality that was occurring on the positive farms were positive. So it turned out that we shifted the surveillance activity from live bird testing to dead birds testing. And another note is that all of the detections were found by producers reporting early mortality. That our surveillance actually didn't pick up any positive farms. It was the farmer phoning their private vet to come get a test because they were experiencing mortality. So mortality was the key indicator on a positive. So this was just to show that in some of these barns, December 2nd, CFIA went into a dangerous contact that was identified, and their live bird sampling was negative on December 2nd. The live bird sampling was negative on December 4th, but the dead birds were positive. Again, the same thing. Going in and taking live bird samples, it was negative, but the dead bird detections were positive. And the same thing played out on a layer operation. So this was what the dead bird bin surveillance. All of the commercial poultry operations were given these bins, and each one of these bins was to be put at the end of the driveway containing natural mortality that had occurred once or twice a week, CFIA sampling teams would go around. At the end of the driveway, they would take their samples, and then when they were finished, they would seal them up with a red sticky and then flip the bin over so the producer could bring the dead birds back in and dispose of them. So no birds came off the farm. It was all done by sampling with swabs for PCR. The eradication effort was done through depopulation of the positive detections. So that's how, hopefully, if you get ahead of that, you can actually contain and prevent further environmental spread of the virus. So the summary is that we had 11 commercial farms. Considering that we had that many at risk, that's a huge success story. We had one backyard flock that was detected. We also had a second backyard flock at the beginning of February that tested positive for another variant of the HPAI H5. So it turned out that we only had 250,000 birds destroyed during the effort. So what we learned and all the preparedness activity that preceded this was that the industry had an emergency response plan. The industry had been trained in ICS as well as had some tabletop exercise experience. They knew what to do. They formed their emergency operations center. They provided a really strong communications infrastructure among their producers so that they could get information out to the farms quickly. They also were engaged in media training. They had some media training, so they had spokesmen from the industry representing the farmers. Also, the improved biosecurity, I think, had a key role in containment as well. Mandatory standards were adopted in 2009. Within those standards, there was the ability to immediately enhance biosecurity when we have these detections. Self-quarantine, an incredibly important concept. We give the producer the responsibility to do those first activities to stop movement off the farm. We've done a lot of work with non-regulated and small flock biosecurity education. Just because we needed to have them on side with us. Also, there is a program called the Premises ID program in which every one of the commercial poultry operations in British Columbia has a unique ID and it can be mapped. So this is the unique ID. I won't spend too much time on this. So key elements to the effective control of our outbreak were that we had a FAIDS plan. Everyone had roles and responsibilities already assigned. We knew what to do. There was strong political support for the activity. We also have an incredibly awesome local diagnostic lab that was able to manage the volume of surveillance testing. During the outbreak, we ran approximately 8,400 tests. We have a prepared and engaged industry with strong producer communications infrastructure. Enhanced biosecurity with the premises ID, again, key components. Compensation is acceptable. In other parts of the world, compensation is a huge obstacle to disease containment. And of course, the shared goal of eradication and a team of dedicated and committed people to making sure this would go through. So I want to point out, this is our molecular diagnostics team taking a break. I think the person missing here is Erin. Erin, you should be in this picture. But right now the question is, where do you think the next farm's going to be? And they're pointing to the big outbreak maps. So, but it wasn't over, and I know I'm going to go over time, but I just want to say it wasn't over. Our H5N2 was contained within 18 days. But what happened is something else. It showed back up in the next year in the Midwest. The presumption is that migratory birds took it from our area and then possibly on the way back, coming up through the Mississippi and Central Flyways, brought it to the Midwest, where now we're talking about a very high value, highly concentrated poultry growing area. But you also have to considering you look at that map, and the reds are the detection in the poultry of the H5N2, the specific virus we're dealing with. There's been no detections fairly far south, so we have to still talk about the possibility there was an east-west connection that way. Also, just to point out, in April, there were 3 unlinked outbreaks in Ontario that involved this H5N2. So the outbreak in the States was absolutely catastrophic. They were completely unprepared for this, and even though we tried to let them know what to do. So from December to and June 17th has been the last detection of this virus. So where the heck it is right now, we don't know. It turns out that there were 311 H5 clade 23.4 detections. 6 states are only reporting in wild birds. turns out that only 21 backyard flocks were detected. I'm really surprised because they should be the sentinels for this. It turns out that 15 states had outbreaks in commercial poultry. They had 211 cases. But if you look at this cluster right here, between April and May in Iowa and Minnesota, they had 184 of those outbreaks. At one day, they had 35 farms go positive. Their bird losses were almost 50 million commercial birds. They lost 10% of their layer flock and over 7% of the national turkey flock. Minnesota is really, really heavy on turkeys, and Iowa is certainly the state of layers. To show you quickly here, I think there's some key problems with what happened in the United States. They have these farms. This is a 1.1 million layer farm. It took 23 days to depopulate this farm. So they had huge problems with containment during depopulation and disposal. Birds are taken outside. I think that turned out to be a very strong lesson we learned in 2004 is don't take infected birds outside. They were putting them in these trenches. They were burying them that way. Minnesota called in their National Guard. One of their forms of depopulation is using firefighting foam, but they ran out of water. So this year the National Guard bringing in water tankers to support the foaming operations. And also, here's biosecurity. Buddy, how can you talk about biosecurity when this guy's wandering around? So anyways, what we learned from this is very different from our prior experience. What we believe happened in the first stage, we have the wild birds carrying this high-path virus, causing multiple simultaneous incursions because we have heavy environmental contamination from the wild birds. At this point, I think this is where we kicked in and we were able to get it under control. What happened in the States is what I think that kind of set them on the course of doom. They had huge delays in detection, huge delays in depopulation, and they had a very significant lack of biocontainment during these activities. And I think what happened is we no longer have this dynamic. We've moved into a dynamic of what's happening now, farm to farm spread. And this is where the US had their biggest challenges. So anyways, we don't know what the future holds for this virus. It's possible that this lineage may burn out in North America. We don't know. There's been no detection since June. Or it's possible that there could be continued circulation and geographic spread by wild birds. And with that, we also have to be concerned that novel reassortments may emerge from this, and we don't know the biology and how their behavior is going to be. So we don't know the impact of that. It's possible we may be more like the Netherlands in that we have a perennial threat as birds are raised under migratory pathways. These are interesting times. Vaccination is going to be considered and has been approved by the USDA under certain conditions. And I think we have to maybe all take a step back and start to rethink, why are we responding like this? Why are we having to eradicate? Again, it's an international trade issue. It goes all the way up to the OIE. So who knows where it's going to go. Anyways, sorry for taking so long.